Now, don't get me wrong here. Giving is an extremely important part of our involvement in global mission. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But I'll often hear people say, I'm not going to go anywhere outside where I live. I'll just give. And this reflects an unbiblical understanding of the gospel. I remember one of the first times I went on a trip overseas. I was actually going to Sudan to come alongside the persecuted church there. This is before South Sudan even existed, as they were working to share the gospel in unreached areas. And I remember, it was a pretty expensive trip. I remember somebody coming up to me in the church saying, why are you going to pay all that money to go on a trip? Why don't you just send the money? And I remember wrestling with that. I remember when I went on the trip, I got over there, and I'm spending time with our persecuted brothers and sisters in Sudan. And one of them is a guy, his name was Repent. It's great, like you share the gospel every time you introduce yourself. But Repent, he's talking to me, and he said, David, in all the persecution we've experienced and suffering we've experienced, there have been many people who have done many good things for us, even non-governmental organizations that have come and helped, and we are so thankful. But then he looked me in the eye, and he said, but do you know how I can tell who a true brother is? I said, how? And he said, a true brother comes to be with you in your time of need. He said, I just want to thank you for being my brother. And in that moment, I was just keenly reminded that when God brought salvation to you and me, he didn't send gold or silver, cash or credit. He came himself. So how are we going to share the gospel if we never go ourselves? I trust we're not so shallow as to think our money is the primary answer to the needs of the hurting. Like, we know well in our culture here in Metro DC that money is not the answer. How many neighborhoods among us have large houses, expensive cars, hefty bank accounts, yet homes filled with strife and bitterness and separation from God and hurt and pain and insecurity? God, help us to not think that our money alone is the answer, especially when it comes to people's greatest need, the need for the gospel. And God, help us not to so skew that gospel by sending money while refusing to go ourselves. Not that money isn't important, which we'll get to. But at this point, people say, well, why don't we just let the locals do it? Meaning, aren't there other Christians in the world who can do this better than us? Why don't we just send other Christians who are closer, for example, to the Himalayas? And without question, it is wise and right and good for us to partner together with our brothers and sisters around the world in spreading the gospel to places where it hasn't gone. We must do that. But this kind of language, why don't we just let the locals do it, kind of misses the point. Because when it comes to unreached people, that's the point. There are no locals. It's what it means to be unreached. There are no local Christians, very few local Christians in these 6,000 plus people groups. There aren't churches there. So this statement reflects an unbiblical understanding of the need. This is why Jesus said in Matthew 9, Luke 10, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Get that. Jesus says the problem is not that there aren't people who aren't ready to hear the gospel. They are ready. Translated today, 2 billion people ready. The problem is there aren't Christians going to them. That's the point. And when we say this, we're in essence saying somebody else can do that, but not us. It's like Isaiah before God in Isaiah 6 when God says, whom shall I send? Instead of us saying, like Isaiah, here am I, send me, what we're saying to God when he asks, whom shall I send? Instead of here am I, send me, we're saying, there they are, send them. Basically, God, don't look at me, send somebody else. But what about the needs here, we ask? Meaning, aren't there enough needs in Metro Washington to keep us busy? And to be honest, when people ask this is usually a smokescreen, because the majority of us are not like sharing the gospel and serving the poor right here in Metro Washington. But even if we are, and we say this, we're still flawed in our thinking, because yes, there are needs here, like tons of them. And we want to share and show God's love in the middle of them. Like we said earlier, local mission is totally necessary. But what if every Christian and every church took this philosophy? I'm just going to focus on needs right around me. Here's what would happen. We would ultimately be disobedient to Jesus' command to make disciples of all the nations. And meanwhile, practically, millions of people in the Himalayas and 2 billion people in the world would continue to be born and live and die and enter into an eternity separated from God without ever hearing the gospel.